Hello everyone and welcome to Poser Movie Recaps. Our film today is a sci-fi thriller drama film about a man that is able to save his father from a terrible fate, when he accidentally talks to him on a ham radio from the future. It all begins in 1969, when the northern lights are visible throughout the northern hemisphere, while the news on the radio talks about a serial killer dubbed as the Nightingale, whose usual victims are female nurses. A man driving a petrol truck had an accident, causing a huge mess in the area. The firefighters rush into the scene including a man named Frank, who saves a guy before the petrol truck blows up. Everyone praises Frank for his heroic deeds, and he goes home happy to his family. Frank loves baseball and has a 6-year-old son named John who he often calls Little Chief, and he is married to a beautiful woman named Julia who works as a nurse. Later at night, Frank teaches his son to ride a bike and when John falls, he encourages him to try again but Julia calls the boy inside for bedtime. Before going inside, Frank watches the northern lights in the sky which is currently strong at the time. Due to the influence of solar winds, a lot of radio stations have received an unknown signal. On October 10, 1999, Frank's son John watches as his girlfriend Samantha moved out of their house. John did not inherit his father's passion as a firefighter, instead, he chose the other way and becomes a police officer. After Samantha leaves, he somberly drinks some alcohol in a nearby stadium and reminisces about the recent events. Coincidentally, strong northern lights are visible that night, and it is also nearly the 30-year death anniversary of his father Frank who perished in a fire while in the line of duty. Back at home, his best friend Gordo with his son visits to borrow some fishing supplies and sees an old radio inside the trunk while looking for his fishing rod. Fascinated by the ancient communication device, John shows the boy how to make it work but Gordo's wife calls them to come home. It leaves John with his father's memorabilia and starts looking at his old photos and some articles about his death. Suddenly, someone speaks from the radio which John answers by introducing himself. He learns that the man on the other end lives nearby, and talks happily about his favorite baseball team from the 1969 Baseball World Championship. Since John used to be an avid fan of baseball, he recounts the progress and results of the match, in which the other guy expresses skepticism since the game hasn't even started yet. John gets confused because the match happened 30 years ago, and their conversation is interrupted by some noise feedback from the radio. It turns out that John is talking to a version of his father Frank from 30 years ago, and he's about to realize this. On Frank's side, Julia interrupts him because little John wants to say goodnight to his dad. When he is about to go to his room, he accidentally breaks a glass panel on the door, and the exact identical crack appears on the same door at John's. The next day, Frank watches the most anticipated baseball championship of his time and is very surprised to see that the course of the match goes the same way as John describes. John in the present is at fieldwork, investigating a human skeleton that has been discovered, and asks some neighbors anything they know of it. He learns nothing important at the time, except that Mr. and Mrs. Shepard had a police officer's son named Jack, who died 30 years ago due to a medical incident. Later at night, John's mother Julia visits him and shares her grief for Frank's passing many years ago. It will be his death anniversary on the next day and John expressed that he wishes he knew him more since he died when he was too young. Sometime later, Frank tries to contact John to ask how he knew the baseball score in advance, and ask about the upcoming second day's match situation. John tells him that he knew the details because it happens 30 years ago, and adds some more about the second match. The two are interrupted when little John approaches Frank and asks to sing him a baseball song before bed, and Frank greets him as Little Chief and tells him to wait in his room. At this point, John is surprised and curious about the endearment Frank uses for his son, so he actually asks the guy his name, who officially introduces himself as Frank Sullivan. Initially, John thinks that Gordo is just messing with him and playing pranks, but Frank gives him some more details about himself, including the radio's serial number. John checks the number and discovers that it is exactly the same radio he's currently using, and he reintroduces himself as John Sullivan, gives him his full address where he lives his whole life, adds that he saw the first baseball championship game in 1969, and his father's name is Francis Patrick Sullivan, a firefighter and die-hard Met fan. Hearing a lot of details about his own life, Frank feels nervous and accidentally burns the tabletop. The same burn appears at John's and asks Frank if he just burned the desk. This freaks out Frank because he thought that someone is watching him from outside. He warns John to stay away from his family, but John is now convinced that he is talking to his dead father from 30 years ago, and tries to convince the man that it is him his son. Frank is furious and tells him that if he hurt his son, he will hunt him for the rest of his life. Hearing this, John blurted out that he already died and gives him the details of his death, so he might somehow save himself from the Buxton fire if he choose a different path during the commotion. Frank is shocked and is in denial of the possibility that he will die very soon, so when the next day comes, he tries to act normal as if nothing can go wrong. When the second game is aired, he realizes that John's predictions are true, and when their station responds to a call for a fire at Buxton, he knows for sure that the guys he's been talking to are telling the truth. During the commotion, Frank finds a girl trapped in a fire, and there are only two paths to choose from: one is caught by fire and the other is engulfed by smoke. At first, he thinks that the one in smoke will be safer, but he remembers John's advice and chose the other path instead. At that same moment, John is with Gordo and Satch celebrating the life and death of his father Frank. Suddenly, something strange happens to John and he gets attacked by a surge of new memories overlapping his old ones. Feeling confused, he asks his friends if his father died in a fire, and the two bewildered men answer that his father perished from lung cancer 10 years ago. At this point, John realizes that he changed the future by saving his father from the fire, and also retains two sets of memories of his life. At home, he looks at his family's old keepsake and sees that the article about his dad's death changes. When Frank contacts him at the ham radio, John is elated, so the two happily chat about life and remind his dad to quit smoking. When they say their goodbyes for the night, both of them are in tears and promise to talk again tomorrow. John calls his mother to share what happened, but Julia isn't available, so he ends up leaving a message to her voicemail. Meanwhile, Frank goes to the hospital where Julia works to share the happiness he currently feels when she sees a colleague giving the patient the wrong medicine. She swiftly intervenes to stop the man and correct the mistake, while the patient lying on the bed stares at her. He is the son of Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd, the same policeman who died 30 years ago from a medical incident. Later, John starts tossing in his sleep when a new memory starts popping into his head. He abruptly wakes and calls his mother to check on her, but the number he knew belonged to someone else now. In the morning, John approaches his ex-girlfriend Samantha, but the woman has absolutely no idea who he is. When he reaches the station, Satch tells him that the skeleton they previously discovered has been identified, and she was the first out of the 10 victims of the Nightingale killer. John argues that the Nightingale has only 3 victims and the killing stops 30 years ago, but Satch chastises him that he should know better as he already looked at those files 1,000 times. His boss shows his concern because John's mother Julia was one of the Nightingale's victims. John rushes home to talk to Frank and tells him that something happens to Julia, and by saving him, his mother died a week after Frank's current time. He also relays that Julia becomes one of the Nightingale's victims, and he didn't just kill 3 women anymore, he killed 10. Frank gets hysterical about the changes, but John quickly tries to calm him and asks what he did the night he was saved from the fire, so they can figure out how to save his mother. Frank tells John that he visits Julia at the hospital, and John thinks that it is the first change in the past. Julia isn't supposed to be working if Frank died in the fire because she will be busy with the arrangement of the funeral. They don't know for sure what triggers the event of her demise, so Frank wants to take her away so the killer won't be able to get her. John argues for the other additional victims because it will be on them that they die. As a cop, it is his job to prevent further killings and in the process save his mother. Since John knows of the Nightingale's next victims, he urges his dad to trace the killer himself, because if he tries to report a crime that hasn't happened yet, they will think that he's crazy. Sometime later, Frank goes to a bar where the next victim should be and looks for anyone suspicious inside. He sits at the bar near the woman, but since he keeps looking at her, she thinks that Frank is interested in her and invites him over. He then walks to them to introduce himself, and because of this change, Carrie Reynolds didn't get killed that night. At the police station, the files on Carrie disappear and John figures that his dad had saved her. Later, Frank introduces Julia and Little John to John, and when they leave, he relays the information on the next victim named Clark to Frank. Frank goes early to the bar where Clark works part-time as a cocktail waitress, but when he's about to take a leak, someone hits his head and knocks him out, and took his driver's license while he's passed out. After Frank regains consciousness, he realizes that the killer notices his presence and assaulted him, and learns that he had murdered Clark inside her apartment. This makes him upset for not saving Clark and losing his ID, so he tells John that he wants to stop what they are doing and just take his family away. John is worried, but he realizes that when the killer took Frank's ID, he also touches the wallet, meaning that he left some of his fingerprints. He asks his dad to hide the wallet somewhere where no one is going to disturb it in 30 years, and a moment later, he found his father's wallet in the present. After the prints get processed, John runs it through fingerprint recognition and learns that it matches someone named Jack, the policeman's son of Mr. and Mrs. Shepherd, who's supposed to have died 30 years ago. He discovers that Jack now runs his own private detective agency, and when he goes to his old house, he learns that Jack's mother was also a nurse who became one of the Nightingale's victims. turns out that in order to avoid suspicion, Jack murders his own mother because no one will suspect that the murderer can kill his own mom. John approaches Jack in a diner where he casually tells him the story of the nightingale to gauge his reactions. He then accuses him of changing his MO by killing his mom, so he can avoid being a suspect at the time, and leaves. Later, he instructs Frank to make an anonymous call to the police and tells them a tip about the killer's stash of memorabilia. He adds that Jack takes some jewelry of all his victims, but Satch from the past interrupts their conversation and invites Frank to step outside. Satch reveals that they found Frank's driver's license under Clark's body, and invites the man to come with them at the police station. Frank excused himself so he can say goodbye to his family, but instead, he quickly relays to John what is happening. Satch follows him and forces Frank to leave, but in the commotion, the ham radio falls, causing it to break. At the station, Frank explains that he didn't murder anyone, and in fact, he was trying to prevent the killings by talking to his adult son 30 years from their time. Satch thinks that the man is losing his mind because all the evidence points to the man being guilty of the crime. Suddenly, Frank hears the baseball game being broadcast from the other room and tells Satch that he can prove his knowledge of the future by telling him how the game goes. When someone calls him outside, he leaves Frank in the interrogation room and meets with Julia at the coffee shop. Younger Jack sneaks up at the station to finish Frank, but another policeman shows up, preventing him from doing his nefarious plans. Meanwhile, Satch reveals to Julia the possibility of Frank's involvement in a crime, but when he sees the game on TV, he realizes that Frank is telling the truth about the game and quickly rushes back inside the station. Frank realizes the danger that he's in, so he devises a plan to electrocute Jack if he comes back to finish him. After Jack passes out, he triggers the fire alarm and quickly walks outside to escape while the entire police station is in disarray. Frank goes straight to Jack's house to gather evidence of his crimes and finds a box full of jewelry that belongs to his victims. By this time, Jack is back home and notices that someone has been inside his house, and when he sees Frank, he fires at him and chases him outside. At the same moment, Satch and his partner arrive at Jack's home and hear the gunshot from outside. Frank pulls Jack into the water and thought that he is able to finish the man. A search for Jack's body has been conducted, but they recover nothing from the water, and Frank is absolved of his supposed crime since Jack's box of memorabilia has also been found. In the evening, Frank fixes the ham radio and quickly contacts John to tell him about the recent events. John answers that there's still something wrong since Julia is still dead in his present time. Frank argues that Jack is dead when the older Jack unexpectedly shows up and knocks out John. At the same time, young Jack sneaks at Frank and hits him in the head. He then proceeds to assault Julia in her room, and when she screams, it wakes young John from bed and takes him hostage when Frank points his shotgun at him. In the present, John wakes and fights the older Jack, but the man overpowers him and is about to strangle him to death. But Julia is able to distract Jack at the other side, which gives Frank a chance to shoot his hand, but he escapes. Suddenly, the older Jack's hand slowly disappears and the older Frank appears to finish him off. Finally, Frank and John meet at the present and embrace each other, while the northern lights slowly disappear. The movie ends with John playing baseball with his friends and family, including Frank, Julia, and his 4-year-old son from Samantha. Did you enjoy today's movie recap? Write your comments down below.